What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
My mom handed me cake on my forgotten birthday and said, "At least you're still alive, right?" I took a bite, smiled, then quietly slid the plate across the table to my sister. She collapsed minutes later. All I said was, "Still think I'm invisible?" They always said I was dramatic. Maybe this time, they'll listen. It started 2 days earlier, when I stepped off the train with a heavy overnight bag and that sinking feeling you only get when you're heading somewhere you're not really wanted, but you're still pretending otherwise, clinging to the lie that maybe, just maybe, things will be different this time, even though history has shown you otherwise so many times you could build a wall out of the evidence. The driveway looked the same, overly tidy, like a showroom home no one actually lived in, and I could already hear Lena's laugh through the front windows, the kind of high-pitched, sparkly sound she's perfected over decades of being adored. I paused for just a second before knocking, like I needed to steel myself for the performance I was about to give. The cool, collected daughter, the one who doesn't make a fuss, who doesn't mind being an afterthought, who knows her role and plays it well. When the door opened, Mom gave me a tight smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes, then leaned in for a hug that barely brushed my shoulder. "You look rested," she said, which, in her language, translated to, "You gained weight." Behind her, Lena was arranging flowers in the foyer, all flowing hair and gleaming teeth, wearing a pastel-wrapped dress that looked like it cost more than my entire suitcase. She looked up, gave me a half-smirk and said, "Wow, Ava, you actually came. I told Mom you'd probably bail at the last minute like you did for Thanksgiving." I could have answered with something snappy, but I let it slide, the way I always do, because there's no point in sparring when the referee is rooting for the other team. I just smiled, said, "Good to see you, too," and walked in like I hadn't just swallowed the taste of metal that always hits me when I cross that threshold. The house was full of candles and soft music, and the scent of Mom's special roast chicken drifted through the air like a reminder of what I'd never been given freely: effort, attention, pride. Dinner that night was supposedly for family time, but it was clearly a celebration for Lena's early birthday, even though hers was still a week away and mine had just passed 2 days before. Not one balloon, not one card, not even a generic grocery store bouquet tossed in my direction. Just Lena's name on a cake in gold script, and a table set like a Pinterest post. I took my usual seat, the one slightly off-center from everyone else, and tried not to flinch when Mom tapped her glass with a fork and said, "Let's raise a toast to our little star, Lena, promotion, new house, and Eric's big contract. We're just so proud." I lifted my glass, the same way I had 100 times before, and swallowed the champagne without tasting it. No one mentioned my birthday. No one even looked in my direction. I thought about saying something, just a casual, "Hey, by the way, I turned 36 this week," but the silence felt too thick, too deliberate, like a test I wasn't supposed to pass. I watched Lena soak in the praise like she was sunbathing in it, giggling and demurring, always pretending like the attention made her uncomfortable, when we all knew it was her oxygen. After dinner, we moved to the living room, where Lena opened gifts while I sipped from a sweating glass of wine and made polite noises at the appropriate times. Mom sat next to her, beaming, asking if she liked the necklace, the one she said she'd been saving for someone special. I remembered that necklace. It had belonged to our grandmother. Mom once told me I'd get it someday. I guess someday meant when Lena asked for it. Eventually, the crowd thinned, and only the core remained: me, Lena, Mom, Dad, who had mostly stared at his phone all night, and Lena's husband Eric, who was scrolling through something with that glazed look men get when they've been dragged to a party they know isn't about them. That's when Mom reappeared from the kitchen holding a half-thawed cake, the kind that comes in a plastic clamshell from the freezer aisle, condensation still clinging to the sides. She placed it in front of me like she was dropping off dry cleaning. "I figured we should at least acknowledge your birthday," she said, slicing off a sad little piece and dropping it onto a chipped dessert plate. "At least you're still alive, right?" There was a moment, just a breath, where I felt something cold and sharp twist behind my ribs. Not rage, exactly, more like the death of hope. I took the fork she handed me, dug in, and lifted a bite to my mouth, forcing a smile so convincing I nearly believed it myself. The texture was soggy, the flavor artificial, but I chewed slowly, deliberately, like it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. Then I slid the plate, very gently, across the table toward Lena. She wrinkled her nose but took it, laughing, "Oh, Ava, you're so dramatic about everything." "Fine, I'll eat your cake too." She took a bite, still grinning, and I just watched her. Minutes passed. Then her grin faltered. And mine stayed exactly the same. There's a moment, a small and quiet moment, so easy to miss, when you realize that people aren't just forgetting you, they are deliberately choosing not to see you, not because you're insignificant or unworthy, but because acknowledging you would mean confronting truths that are far too uncomfortable to sit with during dinner or wrap neatly in a card. And in that moment, while Lena licked frosting from her fork and laughed about how she could always eat more sugar because her metabolism was blessed by the gods, I understood something that had been humming under the surface of my skin for years. I wasn't the invisible one because I failed to speak up. I was invisible because being seen would ruin the narrative they had built around her, around me, around what it meant to be a good daughter, a proud mother, a successful family. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the last of the wine glasses had been rinsed and stacked on the drying rack like delicate relics from a false celebration, I lay in the guest room with the door cracked open and the hallway light casting a line of orange across the ceiling, listening to the muffled sound of my mother's voice as she gushed over Lena to my father, recounting the compliments, the designer shoes, the fact that Lena's boss said she had executive energy, whatever that meant. And somewhere between, she's going to be regional by next year. Just watch, and Eric says the Hamptons place is almost ready. I heard the pause, that tiny, breathy space where one might insert my name if they remembered I existed. But instead it passed like an unused comma, and then they went on talking about the lighting in Lena's foyer like it was scripture. It's not that I expected a parade or some grand apology. I'm not delusional. I knew what I was walking into when I packed that weekend bag, when I boarded that train, when I said yes to the invitation that wasn't really an invitation, but more of a performance requirement. Show up, sit down, smile, nod, and don't bring up the past. But still, even knowing all of that, I hadn't expected it to sting so deeply, hadn't expected the raw scrape of that familiar ache, the one that made me feel 12 again. Standing in the background of Lena's ballet recital with a bloody nose because I'd fallen trying to climb the auditorium stairs and no one had noticed for 45 minutes. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was how good I'd gotten at pretending I didn't care. I'd built an entire personality around being unfazed, around finding humor in the neglect, sarcasm in the silence, even pride in the fact that I didn't need their validation the way Lena so obviously did. But sitting at that table, watching them fawn over her like she was spun gold while I was just the space between sentences, I felt the edges of that persona start to fray. I felt something underneath, something older, something sharper, rise to the surface like a warning. The next morning, while the house was still quiet and the coffee pot hadn't yet started sputtering its ritual song, I walked barefoot into the kitchen and opened my purse. Tucked between a packet of gum and a folded receipt was a small plastic vial, innocuous in its presentation, but significant in what it represented. I didn't even have to think about what I was doing. My hand moved on its own, practiced, steady, like this wasn't the first time I'd prepared myself for a moment when words wouldn't be enough. I should pause here and make something clear. I didn't poison anyone. That's not what this is. That's not what I do. I'm not a monster, despite what the last line of last night's dinner might have suggested. But I did bring something with me, something that Lena's medical chart had once mentioned in passing, a mild but potent blend of allergens that, in high doses, could trigger a reaction. It was legal, even over the counter in some countries, often used in minute amounts for allergy desensitization therapy. But Lena wasn't in therapy. Lena was invincible, or so she liked to think. And I wasn't planning anything. Not really. Not yet. I held the vial in my hand, the sunlight catching the curved edge of the label like a secret, and I just stood there, thinking. Not plotting, not deciding, just thinking. About how easy it would be. About how quiet revenge could be, how subtle. How you don't need fire to burn someone down. Sometimes a whisper is enough. I placed it back in my bag and made a pot of coffee. When Lena wandered in half an hour later, her hair perfect despite having just woken up, she gave me that faux surprised face she always did, as if my presence startled her, like I was an unexpected guest in a home that didn't have a room for me. She poured herself some coffee, looked at the weather on her phone, and then said, without lifting her gaze, "You're not still sulking about last night, are you?" I smiled, poured cream into my cup, and stirred slowly. "No," I said, "why would I?" She shrugged, sipping carefully. "You know Mom's not great with dates." That was true. She wasn't great with dates. Unless it was Lena's birthday. Or Lena's promotion. Or Lena's baby shower. Even though she never had kids, they threw her one anyway, just in case. But for me? A text maybe, if I was lucky. And even then, it usually came the day after, accompanied by a vague excuse about her phone or the calendar app or daylight savings. I leaned against the counter and looked at my sister. Really looked at her. The glossed lips, the carefully curated outfit that looked effortless, but probably took an hour to choose, the smug tilt of her chin that said she knew the world would catch her if she ever fell. And I thought about how easy it would be to let her fall, just once. Not to hurt her. Not permanently. But just enough so she'd stop floating, so she'd land hard enough to see what the floor looked like from where I'd always been standing. I said nothing. Just sipped my coffee and smiled. That evening, the guest list returned for round 2, a second dinner, as if one wasn't enough, with more wine, more laughter, more centerpieces. Lena held court as usual, twirling stories like thread, everyone hanging on her every word while I cleared plates and refilled glasses and tried not to scream. And then, just before dessert, Mom turned to me and said, "Ava, would you mind cutting the cake?" I stood slowly, walked to the kitchen, and picked up the knife. It was heavier than I expected. And for a second, just a second, I wondered what would happen if I didn't come back. If I walked out the back door, bag in hand, disappeared into the night without saying goodbye. Would they notice? Would they look up from their forks long enough to realize I'd gone? But I returned, smiling, plate in hand. And this time, I served the cake. The thing about revenge, the truly uncomfortable, unspoken thing, is that it rarely arrives as fire and fury, screaming through the room like a hurricane of justice and retribution. More often, it comes as a breath, a quiet exhale of long-held frustration, a moment of stillness in which someone who has spent their life being dismissed finally decides to act. Not out of rage, but out of a clarity so cold and precise it makes the whole world seem brighter, sharper, almost surgical in its focus. And so it was that night, as I sat at the long dining table in the house where I was never quite welcome and always too aware of my own presence, that I found myself existing inside that breath. The inhale of a moment I had both anticipated and never believed would actually come. The room had grown warmer than it should have been, the candles flickering with an overcompensating glow that made everything feel almost theatrical, like a dinner scene in a melodrama where the tension is stitched into every detail. The way the silverware clinks just a little too loudly, the way the laughter seems rehearsed, the way no one quite looks you in the eye unless they're trying to get a reaction. Lena was mid-story. Something about an awkward intern who brought donuts to a gluten-free meeting, and how she'd had to gently correct him in front of the entire floor, and everyone was hanging on her every word like it was gospel. Mouths curled into deferential smiles, heads tilted in practiced amusement. I wasn't listening, not really. I was watching the cake, a better one this time, no longer the half-frozen apology slab from the night before, but something layered and elegant with sugared flowers that Mom had clearly pre-ordered for Lena's impromptu celebration. There had been no mention of my birthday again, not even in passing. Not a single person had looked in my direction when the plates were passed. They had simply assumed I would serve. And I did quietly, efficiently, as always. I placed the last slice on a plate and held it in my hands for just a second longer than necessary, feeling the slight tremor in my fingers, not from nerves, but from something more potent, awareness. Awareness of the control I held in that moment, awareness of how easily I could upset the balance of this carefully curated gathering with a single choice. But I didn't need poison. I didn't need anything dramatic. All I needed was a gesture, small but deliberate, executed with the kind of confidence that comes not from power but from exhaustion, the kind that builds over decades of being overlooked until finally, you decide the best way to be seen is to stop asking for it. I walked back to the table and placed the plate in front of Lena. She looked up, her expression smooth and smug, and for a second I thought she might decline, pretend she was watching her carbs or offer it to Eric as a show of performative generosity, but instead, she picked up her fork with a flourish and said, "Oh, Ava, you really should have the first piece. It's technically your birthday weekend too, right?" Then, without waiting for an answer, she took a bite. The room continued as if nothing had shifted. Dad poured another glass of wine. Mom asked Lena about the charity gala next month, and Eric scrolled absent-mindedly through his phone. And I sat there, still and silent, watching my sister chew, watching the seconds pass, watching time stretch like elastic pulled too tight. She took another bite, then another, and then she laughed, that high, bright sound that had always grated like broken glass, before pausing mid-sentence. Her hand went to her throat first, instinctively, as if she was trying to swallow something that wasn't food. Her brows drew together, lips parting slightly, and the room didn't notice at first, because it was so used to her commanding attention that no one realized when she stopped. It wasn't until the fork clattered against her plate, a sharp, unnatural sound in the polished quiet, that heads turned. "Lena," Mom said, her voice rising just slightly, the way it did when she was startled, but didn't want to seem alarmed. Lena coughed once, short and dry, then again, longer this time. Her hand tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. Eric sat up straighter. "Are you okay?" And then came the sound, a low, gasping wheeze that cracked the fragile illusion we'd all been performing under. Lena's eyes widened, her breathing shallow and erratic, and she half stood, knocking over her chair in the process, one hand now at her chest, the other gripping the tablecloth like a lifeline. The chaos erupted slowly at first, like a wave catching its breath. Mom was on her feet, panic blooming across her face. "She's choking. Get water. No, wait, Eric, call someone." Dad stood up but didn't move, frozen in that strange paternal paralysis that only activated under extreme duress. Eric had his phone out, fumbled a few numbers, cursed under his breath, then called again. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, eyes locked on Lena as she swayed, her face growing blotchy and red, sweat rising across her brow. She was trying to speak but couldn't form the words, and I knew exactly what she wanted to say, because it was the same thing I'd wanted to say for years. "See me. Help me. Choose me." I leaned forward, slowly, and for the first time that evening, maybe the first time in decades, everyone was looking at me. "Still think I'm invisible?" I asked, my voice calm, steady, not loud but not soft either, just enough to cut through the frenzy like a razor sliding beneath silk. Mom turned to me, eyes wide, horrified, but also confused, as if trying to figure out whether she had just misunderstood something or whether she was finally beginning to understand everything. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but time had bent by then, warped into something elastic and surreal. Lena collapsed just before they entered, her knees buckling beneath her like a puppet whose strings had been cut, and I stood only when they asked me to move. I stepped aside without argument, without expression, and watched as they lifted her, strapped her in, inserted a mask, and wheeled her out into the night. Mom followed in her car. Eric rode in the ambulance. Dad stayed behind for some reason, maybe shock, maybe guilt, maybe because he didn't know what else to do. I cleared the plates, washed the glasses, wiped the table. Then I went upstairs to the guest room and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling in silence, waiting not for sleep, but for the storm I knew would follow. Because whether or not I had done anything, they would believe I had. And maybe that was the point. Maybe belief was more powerful than truth. Maybe this was how the invisible finally became unforgettable. In the hours that followed Lena's collapse, The atmosphere inside that once perfect house shifted from artificial harmony to something raw, exposed, and vibrating with barely contained panic, a kind of breathless silence that seemed to stretch through every wall, gathering tension like a balloon pressed just beyond its limit, moments from bursting. The ambulance had taken her away in a rush of spinning lights and clipped voices, but what lingered behind wasn't grief or concern. Not really, it was confusion wrapped in suspicion. The creeping sense that something had fractured beneath the surface of this polished family facade, and no one wanted to be the first to look directly at the crack. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the guest room beneath the floral quilt Mom had bought from a catalog 15 years ago, the same one that had always scratched against my skin like it knew I didn't belong, and stared at the popcorn ceiling while the digital clock on the dresser glowed through the dark, each blinking number dragging me further into stillness. Down the hall, I could hear my father pacing, not constantly, but in short, uncertain bursts, as if he wasn't sure whether he should be comforting my mother or distancing himself from the entire situation altogether. He chose the latter, as he always did. Distance was his natural state. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of damp light that made everything look older, tired, slightly washed out. I didn't bother showering. I pulled on yesterday's jeans, tied my hair in a knot that looked careless but took effort, and went downstairs to find the kitchen humming with the ghost of routine. The coffee pot was already half empty, the mugs lined up like soldiers on the counter, and my father sat at the table with the newspaper spread in front of him, not reading it but using it as a shield, pretending to be busy while the silence did all the talking. He looked up when I entered, his eyes bloodshot not from crying but from fatigue, and for the briefest moment, I saw something flicker behind his expression, not accusation, not worry, but something quieter and more dangerous, awareness. He knew. Or he thought he did. And I could see him running through every interaction from the night before, every look, every word, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense, a cause and effect that he could name out loud, something to point to, something to blame. But he said nothing, just nodded toward the coffee and went back to hiding behind the obituaries. I poured a cup, sat down across from him, and took a long sip. The silence stretched again, thick as syrup, until finally he folded the paper and set it aside. They ran tests, he said, not looking at me directly. Said it was anaphylaxis. Sudden. Severe. I nodded, neutral. Lena's allergic to almonds. Yeah, he muttered, almost to himself. Didn't know there were any in the cake. There weren't, I answered softly, meeting his eyes now. I checked the box. He blinked. Once. Then twice. You checked it. I served it, I reminded him, the corners of my mouth lifting into something that wasn't quite a smile. Figured I should know what I was dishing out. He swallowed, jaw tightening, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face before he looked away again, staring out the window like it offered a better answer than I ever could. I didn't elaborate. I didn't explain. I didn't confess. Because there was nothing to confess, not really. I hadn't put anything in the cake. I hadn't laced it, hadn't tampered with it, hadn't so much as glanced at an almond all weekend. But I had brought that vial. I had thought about it. I had weighed the possibility in the quiet corners of my mind. And I had, at least once, imagined what it might feel like to watch her choke on the years of silence she had helped create. But I hadn't done it. That mattered, didn't it? My phone buzzed against the countertop, a message from an unknown number, probably a nurse or hospital admin, sent from Mom's phone or Eric's. I opened it with deliberate slowness. She's awake. Still weak. They're keeping her for observation. Doctors say she was lucky. Lucky. That word sat in my mouth like a stone. Was it luck, really, to survive something you might have brought on yourself? To float just close enough to death to feel its chill but not be changed by it in any meaningful way? Or was it just delay, a brief intermission before the next act in a life where nothing is learned and nothing is earned? I set the phone down and turned back to my father, who was now watching me again, less guarded than before, but still wary, like he was speaking to a stranger who wore his daughter's face. You didn't, he began, then stopped, shook his head. Never mind. But I finished the sentence anyway, the way I used to finish his sentences as a child, back when I thought we had some secret understanding. Didn't what? Poison her. His eyes locked on mine, the air between us tightening like a pulled string. No, I said softly. I didn't. He nodded once, slowly. Then said, but you wanted to. It wasn't a question. And I didn't answer. Because there are things you don't say, even to the people who raised you, even when the silence between you has grown so wide it feels like an ocean. Some truths are too sharp for ordinary mornings. They live in the spaces between sentences, in the way we don't look at each other long enough, in the way we don't ask the questions that already haunt us. By afternoon, the house had settled into a kind of sterile quiet. Mom hadn't come home. She was still at the hospital with Lena, clutching her hand, whispering apologies and promises and probably asking for forgiveness she didn't believe she needed. Eric had texted too, short and polite, as always. We'll be in touch when she's ready for visitors. Maybe later this week. I didn't respond. I didn't intend to visit. Instead, I went up to my childhood room, which had been converted into some sort of exercise space Mom never actually used, and sat on the floor with my back against the mirror, surrounded by yoga mats and unopened dumbbell sets. I reached into my bag and pulled out the vial, still sealed, untouched, and turned it over in my fingers. It was light, nearly weightless, which somehow made it more dangerous. I held it to the light, watched the liquid glint faintly, then unscrewed the cap and poured it into the toilet. Not out of guilt. Not because I was afraid. But because it had served its purpose. I had never needed to use it. Just having it had been enough. When I returned to the kitchen, my father was gone. The paper was gone. The silence remained. I sat alone at the table and stared at the empty space across from me, the place where Lena had sat the night before, smug and sparkling, untouchable. And I let the quiet settle around me like smoke from a long-extinguished flame. Let them wonder. Let them whisper. Let them sit with the weight of uncertainty, the same weight I had carried for 36 years. Because what comes around doesn't always arrive as vengeance. Sometimes it arrives as silence. And sometimes, silence is the loudest scream you'll ever hear. There is something peculiar, almost cruelly elegant, about the way time slows down after the storm has passed, when the adrenaline has drained from everyone's veins, when the last screams have quieted into whispers and the sharp edges of panic are dulled by the mechanical repetition of normal life reasserting itself. You'd think, perhaps, that after a family emergency, a near-death experience at the dinner table, and a night that ended in sirens and paramedics, there would be chaos, confrontation, maybe even accusations flying like knives. But in truth, what followed was stranger, more disorienting, and infinitely more hollow. It was silence. A heavy, deliberate silence that felt less like peace and more like a ceasefire, the kind where everyone is too afraid to speak first, not because they're unsure of the truth, but because they know it all too well and refuse to look it in the eye. 2 days after Lena's allergic reaction, I packed my overnight bag, zipped it up slowly, methodically, as if by dragging out the process I might avoid the inevitable awkward farewell. The staged hugs and the brittle half-smiles that always accompanied my exits from that house. The guest room, still pristine and untouched beyond the indentations of my presence, offered no emotional tether, no reason to linger, no nostalgia to soak in. It was just a room, like every other room in that house, designed to be looked at but not lived in. Mom still hadn't returned. She had opted to stay by Lena's hospital bed, an act of motherly devotion that, in another family, might have inspired some warmth, but here only confirmed what I had known all along when it came to choosing sides. She had never even considered pretending to be neutral. Downstairs, Dad had already retreated behind his routine, his back to me as he rinsed his coffee mug with a kind of exaggerated focus that betrayed how much he didn't want to talk. Didn't want to risk saying the wrong thing and shattering the illusion that this was just another visit, just another Sunday morning. I didn't press him. We had said all that needed to be said in the quiet tension of the kitchen 2 days before, in that single exchange where neither of us had dared to name what lingered between us. So I shouldered my bag, nodded once, and walked out the door with nothing more than the echo of my footsteps and the faint, unmistakable sense that, for the first time in my life, I was not the one being left behind. The city felt colder than I remembered. Or maybe I had just grown more attuned to the chill. My apartment, small, cluttered, full of color and chaos, embraced me like a sigh. It didn't ask me to perform. It didn't ask me to explain. I dropped my bag by the door, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling until the sharp angles of the fluorescent-lit hospital room in my memory began to fade into something more abstract. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't reach for the phone to update anyone. Instead, I sat there for what must have been an hour, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old pipes, letting the quiet wrap around me not like silence, but like armor. It wasn't until the next afternoon that I decided to visit. Not because I wanted to. Not because I owed anyone closure. But because I needed to see her, to see if anything had changed, not just in her body, but in her eyes. I needed to know if the fall from her pedestal had left even the smallest crack in the glass. The hospital smelled like every hospital, sterile, over-sanitized, with a faint undercurrent of something metallic and clinical that made you want to hold your breath in the elevators. The nurse at the front desk recognized Lena's name instantly and pointed me toward her room without asking any questions, though her eyes lingered on me a second too long. The way people look at you when they've heard just enough gossip to recognize your face, but not enough to understand what's true. Lena's room was on the 3rd floor. The door was slightly ajar. I knocked once, not loudly, then pushed it open. She was propped up against a bank of pillows, her skin still pale, her lips cracked at the corners, and though the oxygen had been removed, she still looked like someone who had been scraped raw. For the first time in my life, she looked small. Not delicate, not graceful, but genuinely diminished. Her eyes flicked up as I entered, and for a second, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched again, but this one was different. This one was not about avoidance. This one was heavy with recognition. "You came," she said, her voice rough as though each word scraped against her throat. I nodded. "You look like hell." A ghost of a smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Feels worse." I sat down in the chair beside the bed, crossed my legs, and stared at the tray of untouched food beside her. Hospital cake. Bland, square, frosting too sweet, the kind no one ever finishes. "Do you remember what happened?" I asked, not gently, but not cruelly either. She hesitated. "Bits and pieces. Mom said I had some reaction. They're still running tests. Some cross-contamination, maybe." Her voice faltered on the last word, and I saw the flicker behind her eyes, that twitch of uncertainty, the place where memory and fear collide. She didn't say more. She didn't accuse. But she didn't have to. "I didn't do it," I said, watching her reaction. "But I wanted to." She didn't blink. She didn't gasp. She just looked at me, really looked at me, in a way she never had before, not through the lens of competition or condescension, but through something deeper. Something that might have been understanding. "I know," she whispered, and it wasn't clear whether she meant the first part or the second. I stood, placed a small bouquet of flowers on the windowsill, nothing dramatic, just daisies, plain and bright, and leaned in slightly, enough for her to hear me clearly. "I didn't need to hurt you, Lena. You did that all by yourself." She looked away then, eyes wet but unblinking, and I walked out before the moment could turn into something weaker, something softer than I was willing to give. Back in my apartment, I made tea, not because I wanted it, but because the ritual helped. The steam rose in ribbons, fogging the window slightly as the sky outside darkened with the slow crawl of evening. I sat down at the kitchen table, lit a single candle, and for the first time in years, I felt the air shift around me. Not because something had ended, but because something had finally begun. I didn't hear from my mother that night. She didn't call. She didn't text. There was no apology, no reckoning, no sudden burst of maternal clarity. But I knew she had questions. I knew she had doubts. And that was enough. Because from now on, every birthday, every dinner, every family gathering, they would look at me differently, not with love, perhaps not even with fear, but with awareness. with the knowledge that I was not the quiet one, not the overlooked one, not the invisible daughter folding herself into the corners of their perfect narrative. I was the echo that never left the room. And nothing, absolutely nothing, tastes sweeter than finally being seen, even if they never say it out loud.